The world did not end with a bang, but with the shattering of crystal. For Clara, the sound was a guillotine, a final, definitive severing of the thin thread from which her life precariously hung. The symphony of clinking silverware, hushed conversations, and the distant, melancholic sigh of a cello in the restaurant's lounge ceased. In its place, a vacuum of silence, punctuated only by the sharp, collective intake of breath from the surrounding tables. On the pristine white marble floor lay the carnage, a puddle of crimson wine, glistening like blood under the recessed lights, and the glittering shards of what had been, moments before, a flute of vintage champagne. Her hands, raw and chapped from hours of polishing glasses just like it, trembled uncontrollably. Her gaze lifted from the disaster at her feet to the face of its architect, a portly man in a tailored suit who had lurched backward in his chair, his arm flung out with careless entitlement. He was laughing, a boorish, rumbling sound that made her stomach clench. But it was not his face that held her terror. It was the face of Mrs. Eleanor Croft, the restaurant's owner, whose features were hardening from their usual state of icy disapproval into something akin to pure granite. Her eyes, small and dark, pinned Clara to the spot. The world shrank to the space between them, a battlefield of power and powerlessness. Clara, in her simple black uniform, felt herself disappearing, becoming as insignificant as the dust motes dancing in the shafts of golden light. She clutched reflexively at the one solid thing in her universe, the cool metal of the silver pendant that rested in the hollow of her throat. It was her anchor, her history, the only thing she truly owned. The air grew thick, heavy with impending judgment.
It was more than a spilled drink.
It was a violation of a sacred space, an intrusion of her clumsy poverty into this hermetically sealed world of obscene wealth. From a secluded alcove across the dining room, Sheikh Khalid al-Jamil observed the scene with an air of profound detachment. The spectacle was as predictable as it was distasteful. He had seen this play performed 100 times in 100 cities, the casual arrogance of the new rich, the theatrical fury of the proprietor, the cowering fear of the serving class. It was a vulgar tableau, a stain on the otherwise impeccable elegance of the evening he had planned. His long-fingered hands rested on the starched white linen of the table, his posture immaculate in his traditional white thobe. His aide, Ferris, a man whose loyalty was etched into his very being, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Shall I have the manager intervene, Your Excellency?" Ferris murmured, his voice a low thrum of deference. Khalid raised a single finger, a gesture that commanded absolute stillness. He was not interested in intervention. He was a student of human nature, and this was a particularly pure specimen of its ugliness. He watched the owner, Mrs. Croft, rise from her table, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator approaching wounded prey. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It was the dismissal, the public humiliation, that he expected. He was about to turn his attention back to the untouched plate of saffron-infused risotto before him when the girl, the waitress, was physically seized by the arm by the restaurant manager. As she was pulled away, her head bowed in shame, the overhead light caught something at her neck. It was a flash of silver, intricate and familiar. Khalid's entire being went still. The world, which had been a distant, uninteresting stage, snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. He leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. It was a pendant, a silver falcon, its wings outstretched in mid-flight, a tiny, brilliant blue stone set as its eye. Time ceased to exist. The restaurant, the people, the low hum of conversation, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur. There was only the pendant, a ghost from a buried life. Clara felt the cold night air hit her face like a slap. The heavy oak door of Aurelia slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing the finality of her ruin. The manager, a man named Mr. Henderson whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, had shoved a thin envelope into her hand before practically pushing her onto the pavement. "Mrs. Croft's orders," he had mumbled, his eyes darting everywhere but at her face. "Final wages." She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a pittance, barely enough to cover a week's worth of groceries, let alone the rent that was already 3 weeks overdue. The eviction notice on her apartment door felt less like a threat now, and more like a prophecy. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she leaned against the cold brick wall of the building, the rough texture scraping against her thin uniform. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her foster parents, kind but worn down by life, had passed away 2 years ago, leaving her with nothing but a box of faded photographs and the pendant. She had no other family, no friends she could burden with this kind of disaster. The city, with its millions of indifferent souls, felt like a vast, empty ocean, and she was drowning. Her hand went to the pendant, her thumb tracing the familiar, smooth lines of the falcon's wings. It was all she had left of them, of him. Her father. She had no memory of his face, only a ghost of a sensation, the scratch of a beard against her cheek, a deep, warm voice humming a tune she couldn't recall, and the feeling of this very pendant being placed around her neck. "To guide you, my little falcon," the voice had whispered in her dreams. For 21 years, it had been a piece of a puzzle with no other parts, a relic of a life she couldn't access. Now it felt like the only real thing in a world made of smoke and mirrors. She was just another piece of debris on the streets of a city that devoured the weak. Khalid's voice was dangerously quiet. "The dinner is over." The 2 businessmen across from him, titans of industry who commanded boardrooms with an iron will, blinked in confusion. The main courses had not even been cleared. Ferris, ever attuned to his master's moods, was already rising, discreetly signaling for the bill. "Your Excellency, is everything all right?" one of the men asked, his tone a mixture of concern and sycophancy. Khalid did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the restaurant's entrance, the door through which the girl had been cast out. The image of the silver falcon was burned onto his retinas. He saw it not as it was, but as it had been, resting in the palm of his own hand 2 decades ago in the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the Rub al-Khali Desert. He saw the face of the man he had given it to, David, his friend, his brother. An American geologist with a wild heart and eyes the color of the sky, a man who understood the poetry of the dunes and the silence of the stars. "A bond forged in fire and sand," David had said, his smile wide and bright as he accepted the gift. "Our 2 worlds, one spirit." Khalid had designed it himself. The falcon, a symbol of his own heritage, and the sapphire eye, the color of David's. It was a promise of brotherhood, a talisman to connect them across oceans and continents. And then silence. The news had come a year later, a sterile, impersonal report of a small charter plane gone down in the remote mountains of North America. David, his wife Sarah, and their infant daughter, Amelia, all lost. The grief had hollowed him out, carving a space inside him that wealth and power could never fill. For 20 years, he had believed them gone. But that pendant, it could not be a coincidence. The craftsmanship was unique, his own design. "Ferris," Khalid commanded, his voice a low growl. "I want to know everything about that girl. Her name, her history, where she lives. And I want to know everything about the owner of this establishment. I want to know where she sleeps, what she fears, and what she values. Find it all.
Now."
Clara's apartment was less a home and more a temporary holding cell against the world. It was a single room, small and stuffy, with a cracked window that overlooked a grimy alleyway. The furniture was a collection of mismatched, second-hand items that sagged with the weight of previous lives. The eviction notice was still taped to the door, its bold red letters a constant, screaming reminder of her failure. She sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, the thin envelope from the restaurant lying discarded on the floor. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had spent the last hour searching online for waitress jobs, her heart sinking with each listing that required fine dining experience, or impeccable references, both of which were now ashes. She was tainted, marked by the public humiliation at Aurelia. Who would hire the girl who caused such a scene? Her gaze fell upon her reflection in the small, cloudy mirror hanging on the wall. A pale, tired face stared back at her, her eyes wide with a fear she was trying desperately to keep at bay. Her fingers, as they always did in times of stress, found the falcon pendant. She unclasped it and held it in her palm. In the dim light of her single lamp, the silver seemed to glow with an inner life. The sapphire eye glittered, a tiny blue star in the tarnished metal. Her foster mother had told her the story 100 times. A pair of hikers had found her, a toddler wandering alone in a dense forest, miles from any town. She was malnourished and scared, but physically unharmed. The only things she had with her were the clothes on her back and this intricate pendant clutched in her tiny fist. There were no records, no reports of a missing child that matched. She was a ghost, a child who had appeared out of nowhere. The authorities had named her Clara. The pendant was her only inheritance, the sole proof that she had come from somewhere, from someone. More than once, when rent was late or food was scarce, she had considered selling it. But she never could. It felt like selling her own soul. The file Ferris placed on the polished mahogany table of Khalid's hotel suite was thin, but its contents were explosive. Khalid took it without a word, his face an unreadable mask of controlled calm. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages with an unnerving intensity. The first page was a biography of Clara. Born unknown, found aged approximately 18 months, raised in the state foster care system. A series of different homes, a difficult childhood marked by instability, but no major incidents. She was, by all accounts, hardworking, quiet, and resilient. A survivor. He felt a pang of something sharp and painful in his chest, the ghost of his friend's daughter, adrift in the world alone. He turned the page. The second section detailed the life of Eleanor Croft. New money, inherited from a brutish real estate mogul husband. A reputation for cruelty, a litany of lawsuits from former employees, a social climber of the most venomous sort. Trivial. He flipped past it. It was the final section that made his blood run cold. It was a collection of old news clippings and official reports about the plane crash. The flight of a chartered Cessna from a private airfield. Pilot, David, Sarah, and their 1-year-old daughter, Amelia. The plane had gone down in a heavily wooded, mountainous region. The search and rescue operation was hampered by bad weather. The wreckage was found weeks later. The report stated the bodies of the 3 adults were recovered. It then noted, in cold, bureaucratic language, that due to the severity of the crash and subsequent animal activity, the remains of the infant were never located. Never located. Not confirmed deceased. Assumed lost. For 20 years, he had accepted the official narrative. He had mourned them all. But this single sentence, this sliver of ambiguity, was enough. A child could survive. A child could wander. A child could be found. Ferris, he said, his voice hoarse. Contact our people in America. I want every orphanage record, every hospital admission, every police report of an unidentified child within a 500-mile radius of that crash site for the 6 months following the incident. I want to see a picture of every single 1 inch. Mrs. Eleanor Croft was not accustomed to being summoned. People came to her, hat in hand, seeking reservations, favors, or employment. So when the call came from an aide to Sheikh Khalid al-Jamil, requesting her presence at his penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, her first instinct was to refuse. But the aide's voice, though polite, carried an undertone of absolute command.
It was not a request.
She arrived, cloaked in an armor of Chanel and condescension, expecting to discuss a potential buyout or a lucrative partnership. The suite was breathtaking, with panoramic views of the city skyline. Khalid stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette against the glittering lights, his white thobe giving him an almost ethereal quality. He did not turn when she entered. "Mrs. Croft," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "Thank you for coming, Sheik," she replied, her tone sharp. "I trust this is important. I have a restaurant to run." He finally turned, and the placid look in his eyes unsettled her. There was no warmth, only a deep, ancient coldness. A restaurant is a fragile thing, he mused, as if speaking to himself. It is built on reputation, on an illusion of perfection. An illusion that can be shattered as easily as a champagne flute. A jolt went through her. This was not about a business deal. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, her voice a fraction less steady. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "Last night, you dismissed a young woman from your employment. You did so publicly, cruelly, for an accident that was not her fault," Mrs. Croft bristled. "My staffing decisions are my own affair." The girl was clumsy and incompetent. Khalid's smile did not reach his eyes. "Your building, the one that houses Aurelia. My investment group acquired it this morning. Your lease, I'm afraid, is being terminated. We have other plans for the property." The color drained from her face. This was impossible. This was a hostile, surgical strike. "You can't," she stammered. "I have a contract. Contracts, like champagne flutes, can be broken," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Especially when one party has displayed such a profound lack of character. You mistake wealth for worth, Mrs. Croft. It is a fatal error." The email arrived at 3 in the morning. Ferris entered the suite to find Khalid still awake, still dressed, staring out at the city that never slept. He had not moved in hours, a statue carved from grief and hope. Ferris cleared his throat softly. "Your Excellency, we have something." He held out a tablet. On the screen was a scanned document, a grainy, black and white photograph attached to the top corner. It was an intake form from the St. Jude's Foundling Home, dated 20 years ago. The subject was listed as Jane Doe, approximate age 18 to 24 months. Found by hikers in the Cascade foothills. The notes section described her as unresponsive but physically healthy, clutching a silver pendant. Khalid's hand trembled as he took the tablet. He zoomed in on the photograph. It was a blurry image of a small, round-faced toddler with wide, fearful eyes. Her dark hair was a messy halo around her head. And there, stark against the simple cotton of her smock, was the pendant, the silver falcon. Unmistakable. He could see every detail he had designed, the curve of the wings, the sharp line of the beak, the glint of the tiny sapphire eye. A sound escaped his throat, a choked, guttural noise that was half sob, half gasp. It was her. It was Amelia, David's daughter.
Alive.
The child he had believed dead for 2 decades had been alive all this time, living a life of hardship while he lived in a palace of gold. The weight of those lost years crashed down on him, a physical blow that stole the air from his lungs. He sank into a chair, the tablet held to his chest like a sacred text. The cold, detached sheik, the ruthless businessman, was gone. In his place was a man shattered and remade by a 20-year-old miracle. "Find her, Ferris," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Bring her to me." Now he looked at the photograph again, at the lost, frightened child. "Her name," he said, a tear finally tracing a path down his cheek. "Her name is Amelia." The knock on Clara's door was sharp and authoritative. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was him, the landlord, coming to throw her out personally. She had spent the morning packing her few possessions into a single, battered suitcase, a pathetic collection of worn clothes and second-hand books. With trembling hands, she opened the door a crack. It wasn't the landlord. It was a man in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his expression serious and unreadable. Behind him stood another, larger man. "Clara?" the first man asked. His voice was polite, but held a note of urgency. She nodded, clutching the doorframe. "My name is Ferris. I am an associate of Sheikh Khalid Al-Jamil. He has requested to speak with you." Clara stared at him, bewildered. A sheik? She had no idea who that was. I think you have the wrong person," she stammered. "I assure you I do not," Ferris said patiently. "This is a matter of great importance. He is waiting for you. Please come with us." Fear warred with a sliver of desperate curiosity. What could a sheik possibly want with her? It made no sense. But her other option was to sit here and wait to be thrown onto the street. With a sense of unreality, she grabbed her thin coat and followed the men to a black sedan waiting at the curb. The drive to the Four Seasons was a silent, surreal blur. She was led through the opulent lobby, past guests dripping with diamonds, feeling more out of place than she ever had at Aurelia. They rode the private elevator to the penthouse suite. The door opened into a room that seemed larger than her entire apartment building. And there, standing by the window, was a tall man in a white thobe, his back to her. He turned slowly, and her breath caught. It was the man from the restaurant, the one who had been watching. His dark eyes were not cold now. They were filled with an emotion so intense it was almost painful to look at. His gaze dropped from her face to her neck, to the silver falcon resting against her skin. Khalid felt the world tilt on its axis. Seeing her here, in the flesh, the pendant a tangible confirmation of an impossible truth, was more overwhelming than any photograph. This was David's daughter. She had his wife's gentle eyes and her father's determined set of the jaw. She was a living, breathing fusion of the two people he had loved and lost. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands clenched at his sides to stop them from shaking. "The pendant," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Where did you get it?" Clara's hand flew to her neck, a protective, instinctual gesture. "It was my father's," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's all I have of him." Khalid's control finally broke. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the carefully constructed dam of his composure. "He was my father, too," he said, his voice raw. "Not by blood, by soul. We were brothers." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and hunger. Khalid saw the doubt in her face. He crossed the room to a small, ornate wooden box on a side table. He opened it and took out a faded, leather-bound photograph album. He opened it to the first page. It was a picture of two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning in the harsh desert sun. One was a younger, carefree version of himself. The other was a handsome American with bright, laughing eyes. Around the American's neck was the silver falcon pendant. "His name was David," Khalid said softly, his voice trembling. "He was the best man I have ever known. He spoke of you constantly. His little falcon. His Amelia." The name hit her like a physical blow. Amelia. A name she'd never heard. Yet it felt
Right.
It felt like coming home. Tears began to well in her eyes as the fragments of her life, the whispers of a forgotten past, suddenly clicked into place. This powerful stranger was not a stranger at all. He was a link to everything she had ever lost, everything she had never known. The dam of her own composure broke, and a sob of grief, of relief, of 21 years of loneliness, tore from her throat. He was her history. He was her family. She was no longer adrift. She was found. The world watched as Aurelia, the glittering temple of haute cuisine, went dark. The gold leaf sign was unceremoniously taken down, the windows papered over, its legacy of cruelty and arrogance erased overnight. Mrs. Croft, stripped of her social standing and her business, faded into a bitter and well-deserved obscurity. But for Amelia, the world was just beginning to fill with light. Khalid became the family she never had, a guardian, a mentor, and a keeper of her father's memory. He told her stories of David's courage, his humor, his love for the vast, open spaces of the world. He showed her pictures of her mother, Sarah, whose gentle smile she now saw in her own reflection. He gave her not just security but an identity. Her life was no longer a question mark but a story, a legacy of a brave adventurer and a loyal friend. One evening, standing on the balcony of a new home, a place that was truly hers, she looked out at the endless city lights. She was no longer the invisible, broken girl who served champagne to the wealthy. She was Amelia, daughter of David, and she was finally, truly, free. Her hand closed around the silver falcon at her neck. It was no longer just a beautiful object or a mysterious relic. It was a promise kept across decades, a symbol of a bond that death could not break, and a guide, just as her father had intended, to a future that was brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. We hope this story moved you and reminded you that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and family can be found in the most unexpected of places. If you enjoyed Amelia's journey from despair to deliverance, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this story with someone who might need a little inspiration today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and uplifting content that celebrates the strength of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue to create stories that matter. Thank you for watching.